Somewhere in northern Spain, buried in a cave, scientists now call the Pit of Bones, researchers found something that doesn't quite make sense at first. Fossilized human bones, hundreds of thousands of years old, showing damage strikingly similar to a condition modern doctors see in one very specific group of patients, hibernating animals. Read that again. Hibernating animals. There's a real, published theory that some of our ancestors may have survived the worst winters on Earth the same way a bear does by shutting the body down and sleeping through most of it. No central heating, no stockpiled grocery store shelves, no down jackets shipped overnight. Just fire, animal hide, and a body forced to adapt to cold that could kill an unprotected person in a matter of hours. By the end of this, you'll understand that surviving in ancient winter wasn't one clever trick. It was an entire overlapping system. Clothing, shelter, food storage, and possibly even biology itself, all bending around one single brutal problem: staying alive until the sun came back. Here's something worth sitting with before we go any further. Human beings are, biologically speaking, a tropical species. Every ape closely related to us lives in warm climates. The oldest fossils in our own lineage all come from Central and Eastern Africa, places that were never at serious risk of snow. Our bodies, stripped down to their basic evolutionary defaults, are built for heat, not cold. And yet humans didn't stay in the tropics. At some point, groups of early hominins pushed steadily northward into regions with freezing temperatures, shortened daylight, and winters that could, without intervention, kill an exposed human body within hours. Archaeological sites like Box Grove in southern England, dated to nearly 500,000 years ago, show early humans hunting and surviving in a climate actively deteriorating toward one of the coldest periods in human history. This wasn't a single one-time migration either. Multiple waves of hominins, not just modern humans, but earlier relatives like Homo erectus and later Neanderthals, independently pushed into cold northern territory across hundreds of thousands of years, each facing the same fundamental mismatch between tropical biology and freezing reality. Neanderthals in particular thrived across Ice Age Europe for well over 200,000 years, enduring repeated glacial cycles that pushed temperatures far below anything their African ancestors had ever experienced. Whatever adaptations made this possible weren't handed down as instinct. They had to be figured out, tested, and passed on generation after generation by individuals who couldn't afford to get the answer wrong even once. So here's the actual puzzle worth asking. A species with zero natural cold tolerance, no fur, no hibernation instinct built into its default biology, somehow didn't just survive in genuinely brutal winter environments, but stayed there generation after generation for hundreds of thousands of years. Because unlike a tropical animal that could simply migrate south and wait out the season, humans in these northern regions had nowhere else to go once winter arrived. Whatever solution they came up with had to work completely every single year, or the group wouldn't be there the following spring. Let's start with the most obvious layer of the solution. Clothing, though obvious, undersells how sophisticated it actually became. A study published in the Journal of Human Evolution found evidence that early humans used bear hides specifically for protection from the cold, stretching back roughly 300,000 years, making it the oldest known example of humans deliberately using bear resources anywhere in the world. Bear fur, thick, dense, and naturally suited to insulating a much larger animal through genuinely brutal winters, gave early humans access to a level of thermal protection their own skin could never provide. This wasn't casual. Cut marks found on bones, combined with toolwear patterns, suggest a deliberate process, hunting or scavenging specific animals, carefully removing the hide, and processing it into something wearable rather than simply draping raw fur over the shoulders. Over time, this developed into genuinely advanced skill, scraping hides clean, softening them, and eventually stitching multiple pieces together into fitted garments rather than simple wraps. A technological leap that mattered enormously in climates where losing body heat wasn't a discomfort. It was a death sentence within hours. Clothing design itself grew remarkably sophisticated once tailoring became possible. Layering emerged as a consistent, independently discovered strategy across cold-adapted cultures worldwide. An inner layer to wick moisture away from the skin, a middle layer to trap warm air, and an outer layer, often specifically treated or oiled, to block wind and shed snow and moisture, Arctic parka designs to trap a pocket of warmed air directly around the face. Refined over countless generations by Inuit and other circumpolar peoples, incorporated fur-lined hoods specifically shaped, a detail modern cold weather gear manufacturers still copy directly, sometimes without fully crediting the thousands of years of trial and error that produced it. Shelter followed a similarly serious logic. Early humans in cold climates built structures specifically designed to trap heat and block wind. Using whatever materials were locally available, wood, animal hide stretched over a frame. Or in some regions, structures built partly from mammoth bones where wood was scarce. Fire sat at the absolute center of winter survival, quite literally. Groups kept a fire burning nearly continuously through the coldest months, not just for warmth, but for cooking, protection from predators, and creating a livable microclimate. Inside an otherwise lethal environment, losing that fire during a genuinely severe cold snap wasn't a minor inconvenience. It could kill an entire group within a single night. In regions where trees were scarce or non-existent, some groups took an even more resourceful approach to shelter. At several sites across Eastern Europe, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of dwellings built partly from mammoth bones, massive skulls, tusks, and leg bones arranged deliberately to form a supporting frame, likely covered with hide or turf to seal in warmth. Building something like this required enormous cooperative effort, dragging and positioning bones from an animal that could weigh several tons, all to construct a structure capable of holding heat through months of brutal cold. Tool technology adapted right alongside clothing and shelter. Specialized bone needles, some dating back tens of thousands of years, allowed for genuinely fitted, tailored garments rather than loose wraps, a detail that made an enormous practical difference. A draped hide leaves gaps where heat escapes and wind gets in. A tailored, stitched garment fitted snugly around the body traps warm air far more effectively, and that difference could plausibly separate a survivable night from a fatal one, solving both a warmth problem and a resource problem simultaneously. A group of bodies pressed. Communal sleeping arrangements did double duty across nearly every one of these cultures. Together inside an enclosed shelter functions as a genuinely effective heating system, each person's own metabolic warmth contributing to a shared, elevated microclimate that no individual could generate alone. It also meant fewer separate fires needed tending, less fuel consumed overall, and fewer opportunities for any single person to quietly succumb to the cold unnoticed during the night. Consider just how unforgiving the actual physics involved really was. An unprotected human body, exposed to genuinely severe winter conditions, wind included, can lose enough core heat to become dangerously hypothermic in under 2 hours. That's the entire margin ancient humans were working with, every single day. And in the most extreme cold, considerably faster than that. Read that again. 2 hours. For months at a time, using nothing but hide, fire, and accumulated knowledge to keep pushing that number back further than their own biology ever intended. Here's a common assumption worth challenging directly, that ancient winter survival basically came down to endurance and luck, gritting through the cold and hoping enough people made it to spring. Read that again, though, because it undersells just how coordinated and deliberate the actual system was. Food storage represents one of the most sophisticated pieces of this puzzle. Because almost nothing grows during winter, and hunting becomes dramatically harder in snow and ice, survival depended entirely on preparation that had to begin months in advance. Various indigenous groups across North America, including the Sioux on the northern plains, stored dried meat, corn, beans, and potatoes specifically to make it through winters where fresh food simply wasn't available. In Scandinavia, communities built large drying racks and hung enormous quantities of fish in the cold Arctic air, producing what's known as stockfish, a preserved food capable of staying safely edible for months at a time. Elsewhere, meat and fat were packed tightly into sacks made from animal skins, a preservation method strikingly similar to the pemmican later used by indigenous peoples across the Americas. None of this happened by accident or last-minute improvisation. It required accurately predicting how much food an entire group would need across an unpredictable number of cold months. And it required that prediction to be right, because running out of stored food partway through winter, with nothing left to hunt or gather, meant starvation, not mere inconvenience. The scale of this food preparation is worth pausing on. A single group might need to preserve enough meat, fish, and stored plant food to feed every member for 4, 5, sometimes 6 consecutive months, with essentially zero margin for error and no reliable way to supplement the stockpile once the snow set in seriously. Fat in particular became an obsession, and for good reason. Fat provides more than double the calories of protein, or carbohydrate per unit of weight, made it far more efficient to store and transport, and became so valuable in cold climates that entire preservation technologies, like the fat and meat mixture known as pemmican, were built specifically around protecting and concentrating it. There's an even stranger layer to this story, though, one that pushes past simple behavior and possibly into biology itself. Researchers examining roughly 7,500 human fossils at Spain's Cima de los Huesos site found bone damage consistent with lesions caused by conditions like rickets and disrupted mineral metabolism, the kind of damage seen today in animals that hibernate for extended periods. The theory this evidence supports is genuinely startling. Some ancient hominins may have responded to extreme seasonal food scarcity by drastically slowing their bodies down, entering a state resembling hibernation, reducing their metabolic and activity needs during the very months when food was most impossible to find. The hibernation-adjacent evidence deserves a closer, more careful look too, because researchers studying the Cima de los Huesos remains aren't claiming these hominins hibernated in the same complete, uninterrupted way a bear does. The proposed pattern is closer to a periodic, seasonal slowdown, reduced activity, reduced metabolic demand, and possibly extended sleep, triggered specifically by the kind of severe, prolonged food scarcity that a genuinely harsh glacial winter would have created. It's a controversial theory, still actively debated among researchers, but the underlying logic is sound. An organism facing months of unavoidable calorie shortage has a genuine incentive to slow its own metabolic engine down, rather than simply burning through fat reserves at a rate that guarantees starvation before spring arrives. If that theory holds up, it reframes ancient winter survival, under sufficiently extreme pressure, may have been capable of bending in a direction most of as something considerably stranger than clever behavior alone. It suggests our own biology, us assume, is reserved exclusively for bears. Let's go even further, because this pattern of radical winter adaptation shows up again and again, well past prehistory, and well past any single continent. Human genetics itself tells part of the story. Inuit populations in Greenland today carry specific genetic adaptations confirmed through modern genomic research that support efficient processing of an extremely fat-rich marine-based diet, precisely the kind of diet that would otherwise be difficult to sustain long-term, but that happens to be exactly what's available and metabolically necessary in an Arctic environment with almost no plant food for most of the year. This isn't cultural adaptation, it's evolution itself, responding to an environment cold enough to demand it. Medieval Europe, astonishingly, developed its own version of drastically reduced winter. Crawl once winter set in. A civil servant documented peasants in Burgundy in 1844 spending activity. Historical records describe communities across France and Russia essentially slowing life down to a much of the day in bed, packing bodies tightly together for warmth, and deliberately eating less to conserve dwindling food supplies. The British Medical Journal, reporting in 1900, described peasants in Russia's Pskov region sleeping for roughly half of the entire year, waking briefly once a day to eat a small piece of bread and check that the fire was still burning before returning to sleep. This wasn't laziness. It was an intentional communal strategy. Reduce metabolic demand, reduce food consumption, and minimize activity in a season where moving around burned calories the group simply couldn't spare. In the French Alps, families reportedly hibernated alongside their own livestock, cows and pigs included, sharing body heat and enclosed space through the harshest months, until spring. Further north and further east, Sami communities across the Arctic regions of Scandinavia. A strategy that solved two problems simultaneously: keeping people warm and keeping essential animals alive. And Russia developed their own deeply specialized winter survival system, built heavily around reindeer. Reindeer provided meat, fat-rich milk, and hides thick enough to construct genuinely effective cold-weather clothing. And portable shelter coverings and the seasonal migration patterns of reindeer herds were tracked and followed with extraordinary precision, knowledge passed down orally across countless generations, allowing entire communities to move in rhythm with the one resource capable of getting them through the darkest, coldest months of the year. In Siberia, indigenous groups, including the Yakut, developed similarly sophisticated adaptations to some of the coldest inhabited regions on the planet. Temperatures capable of dropping to levels that would kill an unprotected person in minutes rather than hours. Multiple insulating layers of fur, carefully engineered dwellings banked with snow for extra insulation, and a diet built almost entirely around fatty, calorie-dense animal products allowed sustained, permanent habitation in conditions that remain genuinely dangerous even with full modern cold weather gear. Norse communities in medieval Scandinavia and Iceland built longhouses specifically designed with survival economics in mind, thick turf walls for insulation, a central hearth kept burning nearly continuously, and often livestock housed at one end of the same structure, providing additional shared body heat during the longest, darkest stretches of the Arctic winter. Some of these longhouses were engineered well enough to keep interior temperatures survivable even when outside conditions turned genuinely lethal. Across entirely different eras and continents, from Ice Age Europe to indigenous North America to medieval Russian villages, the same underlying logic kept reappearing independently. Winter survival wasn't just about staying warm in the moment, it was about ruthlessly managing energy, food, and activity across an entire season, sometimes to a degree that looks, from the outside, remarkably like deliberate hibernation. Here's where it gets a little uncomfortable, in a genuinely interesting way. A lot of what feels like a modern personality quirk during winter isn't actually new. It's an old, deeply embedded survival strategy, still quietly running just without the actual famine that originally justified it. The overwhelming urge to eat more, particularly rich, calorie-dense comfort food, once the weather turns cold isn't simply a lack of willpower. It's a strikingly literal echo of an ancient strategy. Consume more calories, build a buffer, prepare the body for a season of scarcity that, for the vast majority of human history, was genuinely coming. The equally strong urge to stay inside, move less, and sleep longer once winter sets in mirrors, almost exactly the same reduced activity strategy medieval villagers and hibernating hominins may have relied on directly for survival. Modern seasonal grocery shopping still quietly reflects the same ancient instinct too. Sales of hearty, calorie-dense foods, stews, roasts, baked goods reliably spike the moment temperatures drop. Not purely because of taste preference, but because something in human biology still associates cold weather with an urgent old instruction to fatten up before conditions worsen. Home design still echoes it as well. The specific, disproportionate coziness people describe feeling near a fireplace or wrapped in a heavy blanket during a storm isn't purely aesthetic. It taps into an old, deeply embedded association between enclosed warmth, flickering firelight, and safety from a threat that, for most of human history, was entirely real and often lethal. Even seasonal affective disorder, the well-documented dip in mood, an energy many people experience specifically during shorter, darker winter days, may be a modern, maladapted echo of a system that once made complete evolutionary sense. Slow down, conserve energy, wait for the light and food to return. The problem is that the modern world removed the actual danger, extreme cold, unpredictable food scarcity, without removing the underlying biological instinct that evolved specifically to respond to it. So let's bring this together. We tend to imagine ancient winter survival as pure, grim endurance, people simply gritting their teeth against the cold until spring finally arrived. That's not quite what the evidence shows. From bear hide clothing perfected over 300,000 years to fire maintained as a matter of life and death, to food meticulously preserved and rationed across an entire season, to genetics themselves adapting to an unforgiving Arctic diet, to entire communities possibly slowing their bodies down in ways that echo actual hibernation. Ancient winter survival was never a single trick. It was an entire overlapping system, technological, social, and quite possibly biological. all pointed at the same brutal problem. It's worth sitting with just how many separate, independent systems had to work correctly, all at once, every single winter, for any of this to succeed. Clothing had to actually retain heat. Shelter had to actually block wind. Fire had to be tended constantly without failure. For months, food had to be accurately estimated, gathered, and preserved months in advance, with essentially no room for miscalculation. And in the most extreme environments, the body itself may have needed to bend its own metabolic rules just to make the math work. Fail at any single layer badly enough, and the entire system could collapse. None of these solutions arrived instantly or from a single inventive genius. They accumulated slowly, tested against the harshest possible feedback there is, generation after generation, in populations that simply could not afford to keep repeating a mistake that had already proven fatal the previous winter. None of it guaranteed survival. Winters still killed people, sometimes entire groups, when the system failed, when the stored food ran out too early, when the fire went out at the wrong moment, when the cold arrived harder and faster than anyone had prepared for, but often enough, across hundreds of thousands of years. Had no thermometers, no meteorology, no understanding of caloric math, just careful and dozens of unrelated cultures. The system worked, refined generation after generation by people who repeated observation of what got a group through to spring and what didn't. And this is precisely why the geographic spread of successful cold adaptation looks the way it does on a map. Wherever humans permanently settled the coldest parts of the planet, the Arctic Circle, Siberia, the far reaches of Scandinavia, Northern Europe during genuine ice ages, you find the same overlapping cluster of solutions showing up again and again. Fitted, layered clothing, heat-retaining, wind-blocked shelter, a fire or hearth treated as non-negotiable infrastructure rather than eating whatever happened to be available that day. Populations that failed to develop this a luxury, and food systems built explicitly around surviving months of scarcity rather than simply stack all at once, simply didn't remain in those environments long enough to leave much of a trace behind for archaeologists to eventually find. That fossil evidence from the beginning, the one that looked strikingly like hibernation damage, isn't really about proving your ancestors literally slept through winter like bears. It's a reminder of exactly how far our species was, willing to bend, biologically and behaviorally, against a threat that should have made the far north uninhabitable for a fundamentally tropical animal. It's a quietly humbling thought that the version of winter most of us complain about today, an inconvenience solved by adjusting a thermostat, once represented the single hardest recurring challenge our entire species had to solve over and over just to keep existing in half the habitable world. And they solved it without a single thermometer, without any understanding of calories or metabolism, using nothing more than fire, hide, careful observation, and the simple refusal to let winter be the thing that finally ended the story. So the next time winter hits, and you feel that specific, powerful urge to eat something warm and heavy, pull a blanket up to your chin and simply do less than you would in July. Don't brush it off as laziness. You're not being lazy. You're running a system that kept your ancestors alive through winters that should have killed them, quietly still switching on, exactly the way it has for longer than anyone can fully measure.